We're talking to Laura Rittenhouse, the author of Investing Between the Lines, How to Make Smarter Decisions by Decoding CEO Communications. Welcome to Redera audience, and we are excited to talk more about you, the book that is recommended by Warren Buffett. What is the book all about? And why should investors care about what the companies or CEOs are saying nowadays when there are so many regulatory burdens that they have and they can't say much?
Well, that's a very big question. Your comment about regulatory restrictions is exactly why I do this work. Because you're right, there's a great deal of constraint so that it's hard to find companies and CEOs who are communicating candidly and freely. However, there is one document that gives us incredible insights into the quality of leadership, the quality of the corporate culture, and therefore a predictor of future performance of a company. And that communication is the annual letter to shareholders. Now, a lot of people have said to me, that is ridiculous. CEOs don't even write those letters. Now, Warren Buffett writes his letter, and I know this for a fact. I've talked to him, I've talked to his assistant, and he actually starts writing his letter in August before it's before he needs to send it to the publisher in February, the following February. Now, I have done research over the years. I started this after leaving Wall Street. I was working, had started an investor relations business, and I worked with my CEOs. At this time, it was the late 1990s, getting near the dot-com phenomenon. And what was happening then is that the cult of the CEO was in full force. Imagine back in the 80s and before that, a CEO was basically just a job. It hadn't become associated with the type of payouts and the media attention that we see today. And as a result, it became clear that the reputation of that CEO was becoming a greater component, a greater factor in the valuation of the stock price. So remember back then, CEOs like Jack Welch, their reputation certainly drove, as well as his decisions and the results at GE, but it drove a huge premium in GE stock. And there were Roberto Goizueta, the legendary CEO of Coca-Cola, same kind of reputation. So at that time, I decided to read shareholder letters and compare the content in letters with the competitors of my CEO clients. And by comparing them, I could see which CEOs were communicating the most effectively, the most rigorously, the most engagingly. And over time, I developed a whole system, which is why I wrote the book, that allows me to score these letters as an indicator of performance.
Mm-hmm. And we are talking about the publicly listed companies only.
That's correct. Now, it is still possible for private companies, privately held companies, to read speeches, to read communications that are publicly available. But you're right. This is something that's possible with the large number of publicly traded companies.
What do good CEOs communicate, and how do they communicate?
It's funny that they use the words, what do good CEOs communicate? I was thinking about our conversation, and I hadn't really put this together before, but there's an old saying that seems to be popular, that good guys finish last. And the good news about my research is that's not what I'm finding, that the companies, when I'm able to score the amount of truth and lies or positive candor and negative candor in a communication, what I find is that the companies, the CEOs, that communicate a great deal of information using rich vocabulary, a minimum of what I call weasel words. Do you know how the term weasel word came about? The animal, the weasel, is known for invading chicken coops and takes a very long fingernail or paw nails that they have, punctures a hole in the egg of a chicken egg, and then sucks the yolk out. So similar, a weasel word is one in which the word is such that the meaning of the word has been sucked out. So a phrase, a cliche that we find fairly frequently is the cliche, "Our future is bright," which doesn't add much meaning unless there's a great deal of communication after that. Typically, there is not. So these companies, the CEOs, as you have asked, the ones that communicate most effectively actually outperform companies that fail to communicate effectively. And in fact, over the past 10 years, when I calculate the total return, the average of total returns of top scoring companies with those scoring at the bottom, what we found is that the total return of these top performing companies known for candor achieve returns that are 2 times greater than the market.
What does good communication have? Or how investors should consider a communication as good or bad? Or how can they decide? How can they separate the good from the bad?
Well, a simple test, and it's not just investors, but oftentimes I get asked by people, what about politicians? Can you use your work to evaluate the candor of politicians? And yes, it's all possible. So let me mention 3 characteristics. So number 1, being very straightforward in the communication. So it's I don't know if you know the concept of flow. Flow means everything you're involved in an activity or reading a book, and you lose track of time. Everything is so effortless. The book chapters flow one into the other. The work that you're doing, one activity flows into the other, and it's a wonderful feeling. And that's the experience that one has of a well-written executive communication. That one sentence flows into the next, the paragraph flows into the next, and there's a real rhythm, a cadence, an understanding of the coherence of a piece. Warren Buffett works on his letter. They lose count of how many drafts are made, and he appreciates how hard this work is. He told me one time, if I can't find just the right word, then it means I don't understand what I'm talking about or writing about. And so he sees this effort as a strategic exercise in which he's confronted with the realization that he's trying to describe what's important about the business. That's another aspect. You're really digging down. You're not dwelling in the superficials of a business, but you're digging down and wanting to educate the reader, the investor, about what goes on, not just what goes on, what your business is about, but what are the underlying drivers of business performance? How can you educate the investor to understand the elements that go into making profits and gaining competitive advantage? And then a third aspect, in terms of how can you tell a good writer, is the degree to which you're engaged. Do you feel, after reading this communication, that you've actually met this individual, the CEO? Is it written in a personal way so that you get the authenticity? Every leader is different. Everybody has a story. And the most effective communications are the ones in which, after reading it, you say, this is somebody I'd like to meet, or even this is somebody I wouldn't like to meet, but at least you're getting the essence of who that person is, as opposed to a lot of PR platitudes and statements that reveal very little, and you have no idea. You might as well. It has the appearance that the person is a kind of a cardboard character, not a real person.
In the book, you talk about a clue to business success in the part 2, I think, where you talk about in several chapters that how the great stewards of capital, the CEOs, are seeking for cashability. Would you describe what you meant by that and how the communication plays a role in that? in the chapter 4, I think you talk about the capital stewardship.
Well, I think the most important idea behind, and what you're referring to, Manish, is the model that I've created. That, again, is another contribution of this work on business candor. A model of a business that is used by many CEOs that I work with as a diagnostic tool. So what we've been able to do as we've analyzed all of these executive communications, we've been able to see the patterns, the kinds of topics that are reported on over and over and over again by CEOs. And then when we see what those topics are, we've organized them into categories. And what you're referring to are two of the categories, capital stewardship and strategy. And we can talk about the other ones. Capital stewardship is so important that, as you may recall, I created a diagram of these, what I call 7 systems of a sustainable business. And capital stewardship is the system that is, if you call it the sun, and then the other 6 systems are like planets that revolve around the sun. In fact, when Jack Bogle read my book, the founder of Vanguard Funds, he wrote to me, he said, like Copernicus, you have discovered the true position of the sun, meaning he too is a believer that capital stewardship, in the sense that an investor needs to know when they decide to put their money or their time into a company, does this management have attitudes of entrustment, meaning they're going to look out for my capital because they know it's mine and they're stewards, they're custodians of it? Or do they feel they're entitled to it, as we found out in companies like Enron and other companies over the past couple decades? So that's why capital stewardship is so important. And, of course, cash is very important, since the reality is if a business runs out of cash, it's end of the story. And I always find it interesting to read a business communication, a CEO communication, and see that the CEO has not even referred to the cash performance of the business or mentioned their cash strategies, their capital, how they're going to allocate the cash in the business. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. No, it does. And you mentioned in your model there are 7. I mentioned only the 2 of the 7 factors. If you could kind of expand on each of those factors, that would be very exciting. It would be very, very interesting.
Well, I happen to agree with you. And it's thrilling because when I showed the diagram to a CEO or anybody, they can quickly see the interconnection. So think of the diagram as a wheel with the hub being capital stewardship, and then around it are revolving these other systems. But there's a logic to the other systems. So you mentioned strategy. Anyone that's been to business school, anyone that's worked for business, know you have to have a strategy. And what is that strategy? Basically, it's the creation of actions and plans in which to invest the resources, the capital resources, the physical resources of the business. So you've got actions and plans that hopefully are linked to your competitive advantages. But what we look for is not just strategy, because you also need to be aware of the accountability systems, the commitment to accountability by a management and their team. Because without accountability systems, no one, including the people inside the business, are going to know if they're executing that strategy. So that's why accountability is another one of the systems. That would be the 3rd system in the model. And how do we look for accountability? We look for statements in which the CEO will say, well, we had a goal to increase our return on equity by 40 basis points, and we didn't meet that goal. We got to 35, but we're working on it. We hope to get there next year. That's rare to find, but I have found that. So those 2 systems, and they're what I call the left brain system, because it requires the kinds of mental capabilities like analytic, deductive reasoning, evaluation. But if we go to the right side of the brain, that's when we think about the vision system. Now, the strategy is all the decisions that are made about the past and the present. But in a business, you need to know where you're going, and that's why you need a vision. But a vision, like strategy, needs to be supported by a system of leadership. Because without strong leadership, strong, relevant, capable, reliable leadership, you're probably going to have a pretty flaky vision. And that doesn't bode well for a business for obvious reasons. So that vector, I call that vector, it intersects capital stewardship, and vision is aligned with strategy and also leadership. And if you'll recall, the other two systems, the last two systems, those are the five. The first was the quality of relationships, the system of relating, and the relationships in the business. Now that system has to be supported by a commitment to candor. And what is candor? The dictionary defines it as rooted in the Latin word for candere, meaning candle, meaning to shine, to illuminate, to shine light into dark places. Now, when you're reading a letter, it's very hard to see positive candor, truth-telling, but it is very clear to see the evidence of negative candor, meaning statements that are made that are not backed up with any facts. Statements in which, for example, a company might say, our cash flow is very strong this year, but then they don't tell us anything more about that. So how can we really know if it was strong, and why aren't they supporting that statement? We look for evidence of contradictions. We often find in a communication, the speaker, the writer will say one thing, and then a number of paragraphs later they'll contradict this with another statement. We find CEOs and companies that use lots and lots of business jargon, maybe just garden variety business jargon, like where our momentum is growing, or more technical jargon. A lot of times in the health sector sphere and technology, there'll be words that are known to insiders, but an outsider would just have to scratch their head and not know what they're talking about. So again, negative candor shows a failure to communicate. So now, why are quality of relationships and candor connected? Because candor is the language of trust. And without candor, you can't have trust. And if you don't have trust, you will have very poor quality relationships. You will have customers who will not be loyal. You will have employees that will not be doing their best. You will have investors that will buy and sell you in the drop of a hat. These are not situations that are going to support a strong and robust stock price. So that's the whole system. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. How do you deal, or have you come across in your research when you look at all these companies? And I think in somewhere you do talk about comparing the two companies, like Pepsi versus Coke, or HP versus Dell, and Lowe's versus Home Depot. These are traditional rivals. If you would go and kind of compare these corporate heavyweights, how they have dealt in communicating with their shareholders.
Well, we do that quite a lot. I'll tell you two stories because they're terrific stories. And again, the point I want to take, and I'm kind of anticipating one of your questions, Manish, that why do I do this work? Why do I do this work? Because I'm so passionate about words and the power of words. What do we forget as human beings? Human beings are wired to be really crazy, let's face it. Warren Buffett has become a multi-billionaire because he refuses to succumb to crazy human wiring. But so what do I mean by that? I mean that companies, people who believe that words don't matter, lose touch, Yes, let me give you an example. I'll compare and contrast Walmart and Costco. Last year, the Walmart shareholder letter, we analyzed it. Remember I talked a little while ago about the concept of flow. Well, if you go back and read, this is their letter that came out in 2015 about their 14 performance, came out last year. If you read the first paragraph in that letter, you find there is absolutely no flow. One sentence doesn't connect with the next sentence, then a cliche is thrown in, then a statement is made which to the effect that the company is investing in lots of things so that it can be prepared for e-commerce. Well, e-commerce has been around for over a decade, and it's not clear why they would want to boast that they're getting prepared for this. There must be something else they're trying to say there. However, if you read the first paragraph in Costco's letter, it's like a symphony. It's like a Mozart symphony. One sentence flows into the next. The next sentence anticipates a question, and the next sentence after that answers that question. It's just harmonious. It's a lovely thing to read. It's not earth-shattering what they're saying, but it's impossible to find the fog in that. Fog, by the way, which is my acronym for fact deficient, F, obfuscating, O, generalities, which kind of encapsulates the kind of fog that we run into. So who cares? So Walmart's letter is written not with flow, Costco's is. Well, look back 5 years ago. Had you invested in both companies, your Walmart investment would have appreciated 17%, while your Costco investment would have grown 110%.
Are you saying that the clarity that the management have and in communication is partly or in many ways driven by the clarity in execution and clarity in the strategy that they have, which is really the drivers of the corporate performance?
Bingo. Absolutely. Absolutely. Clarity is key, and you're so right, because we're in a business. It's like you're fighting a war, and in any war, you got to have clear directions. Otherwise, the troops will be running off in different directions, maybe firing on each other. There's no sense of how one skirmish battle might lead to another. Clarity is everything, and to your point, it's for execution. Now, it's execution so people know what to do and where to be and how to perform. But it's also those more intangible qualities. How committed am I? If the leader is making a great effort to ensure, because they really care about their employees. You go to Costco. I love going to Costco because I go in there, and every time I go in, and I don't care where it is in the United States, I'll talk to the people who work there, and you can tell they're not just employees, they're owners. I'll ask someone, can you tell me where whatever this thing is, where can I find it? They won't tell me. They'll walk with me to go to the place so to make sure I find it. That's how you tell the difference between a company that has clarity and vision and the kind of candor that engages people so that they feel like owners, not just people that are punching a clock every day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How do you compare with Dell and HP communications?
Well, that was in the book. I'll have to go back and reread that. But it was HP is a strange story.
Because if you ask me, in the world of investors, they both have been losers. There can't be anyone better than the other.
It's very interesting. I can't remember. I know we have these. By the way, you know from the book that we do these charts that are so interesting because we're able to plot over time the changes in the annual rankings of a company, and then compare it with a competitor, and then also see how that tracks their stock price. And what was fascinating about Dell and HP, and this is in the well, gosh, it goes back to Carly Fiorina in 2000, 2001, right? And she had muscled through this acquisition of Compaq to the great consternation of some of the founders of the company. It was a bloody battle. And what was fascinating was, if you really believed in this work that I'm talking about, and if you read her shareholder letter that she wrote after the deal had closed, but they were now figuring out, okay, now we own this, what do we do with it? If you had read that letter, you would have said, oh, there's no way they're going to succeed with this. And how could you conclude that? You would read the story. Now, again, do words really matter? Yes, because they create the future. She or whoever authored her letter for her wrote a story legitimately addressing a question that most everybody had who was an owner of HP. Okay, so how are you going to pull this off? You bought this big company. How are you going to integrate it? How are you going to execute it? So, to her credit, she addressed that question, and to give investors confidence, she said, well, let me tell you a story that will support why we're going to be able to do this. And the story she said was, I think it was one of the two founders had worked for GE, and I think it was Dave Packard. And his job at GE at that time was to come up with some kind of new technology for light bulbs. And so he would go to the laboratory every day and try experiment after experiment after experiment after experiment to come up with the right configuration of materials and wiring or whatever was needed to accomplish this task. And after many, many, many months, he succeeded. And this was the evidence she's giving to say that they're going to be able to merge a huge company with very complex systems in both areas, with some overlapping businesses, and all the disruption that goes with mergers. To compare that complexity with the single-mindedness, which was laudatory, but of a single person working in a laboratory, just seemed to me, number one, Carly Fiorina didn't get it, and secondly, no one was empowered or courageous enough to tell her this is not the best story to use to demonstrate our confidence in this merger.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you?
No, it makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense. There was a fog in their mind.
It's funny.
And that fog was reflected in their communication.
Well, it was reflected in the communication and in the culture of the company. So there you had, and of course that whatever it was, that merger probably was one of the precipitating events for the eventual decline of HP, which is unfortunate. And I think Meg Whitman, who's currently there, I think she's done. I think of all the CEOs they've had since that time, she's probably made the best effort, communication-wise and strategic-wise, to turn around that situation. But I think the environment in technology has changed so much. It's just it's as they say, a whole different ballpark.
Mm-hmm. What about Dell?
Well, Dell at the time that Dell had a great business model, right? They had a great business model. But then they continued to have a business model based on hardware, and that's not where the industry was going. And so Michael Dell, he had some great years and some great profits, but then was not able to adapt and change. And now he's, then he went private, and now I haven't really been following them.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Are you seeing a connection between Dell and HP?
No, I mean I do understand that I'm trying to understand that how their communication was any different or better or unique in a sense that could have given you a predictive power or predictability in the corporate performance. HP is still a work in progress. We all know it's going to take probably many years and probably it's going to take another CEO before it will happen. But Dell is also going through the same situation because it has a different owners now who have different priorities. But that is today, not yesterday or 5 years ago. But I'm just trying to understand how both were facing HP the challenges of HP were very clear, but what the challenges were Dell, were they clarified or clear in the communication?
I'm looking at the chart in my book on page 149, and it shows it's quite striking. The pattern of candor and stock price is very, very significant. I mean, it's highly correlated. So in 2004, it was the stock price was nearing its peak, and the candor ranking was anticipating that. It was as high. It ranked 10th in our overall survey. By 2006, just 2 years later, the candor ranking had dropped to 90th place. It was huge drop. And it took another 2 or 3 years for the stock price, 2 years for the stock price to see to trade down to the point where the candor had dropped. And then it really hasn't, it didn't recover, and now he's a private company. So it's funny, I see here that Dell used the word context. You and I talked about that earlier. Context, he actually used that word in his 2003 and 2002 shareholder letters. But by 2009, that was the height of the economic collapse, it was traded at its lowest level over over the prior 10 years. I think it's important to say, and I'd be curious in your thoughts on this, but one thing we haven't really focused on is the corporate culture and how the kinds of communication that are produced by a company both reflect the quality of that culture and also shape that culture going forward.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I have often said, by the way, the work that I'm doing is now has been chosen by the CFA organization, Certified Financial Analysts around the world, to be included in what they call their Future of Finance initiative, which means that they're looking at non-traditional methodologies in which to make sound investment decisions. And what I often say in meetings with investors is, in response to what many investors say to me, I'm not going to look at the words. Words are slippery. I'm going to look at the numbers. And I respond by making two observations. Number one, sure, numbers are very precise. So a number two is a number two is number two, whereas the word to, I'm going to the store, I can go to also to get 2 eggs. So you've got 3 different spellings of the word to. So it's not quite so precise. However, just because a number is precise doesn't mean it's accurate. And those two ideas get conflated. Now, doesn't mean it's accurate. So then what does a corporate culture have to do with that? Well, I remind them, where do the financial accounting numbers, if you say the financial accounting is where you're going to make your decisions, that's great, but where do those numbers come from? They come from the culture of the company, the culture of the business, because those numbers are the result of hundreds or thousands of people throughout a company counting up the cash that's coming in, deciding when they're going to report it as earnings, deciding how they're going to report it, how much they're going to report. And all those decisions come together to create a financial statement and a balance sheet. So my question to investors is, don't you want to know the kind of culture, the values in that business that determine whether the judgments made by all those people are going to be conservative, like you would find in a Berkshire Hathaway, or are they going to be more like the decisions made at an Enron or a Health South, or companies that got into a lot of accounting problems and fraudulent reporting.
Very well said. In your work, have you had time to look at and group them together, like Enron, Adelphia, and Blockbuster, and many of the companies may not have been fraud all along, but some of them have been fraud. Some of them have failed simply because they failed to see the competition evolving. But was it ever evident or consistent that you could see in those patterns, especially in Enron, so WorldCom or Adelphia, or any of those companies?
The answer is yes. In fact, it's shockingly yes.
Or even Bear Stearns, yes.
Well, I think this is a story I tell in my book. So in 2001, Enron published its shareholder letter, and I read the first paragraph, and the last sentence in the first paragraph reported that the company had made $1.3 billion in net income, the first time it achieved over $1 billion in net income. And so one simple test we have is we take that number and we go look at the financial statement to see if we could find that same number in the financial statement. Well, we couldn't. It wasn't there. And so the next stop on that journey is to look through the financial footnotes. And after some time, we discovered a footnote which reconciled the fact that the accounting number on the financial statement in the same annual report was not 1.3 billion, but was 979 million. And this footnote showed that the 1.3 billion came from accounting, and if you can't see me, but I'm doing quotes, air quotes. It came from the profits from their Zurich subsidiary, the water subsidiary that proved to be the place where all the crazy accounting schemes are going on. So they were booking fictitious income and reporting that in their annual report, even though the financial statement, which is blessed by the accountants, had a totally different number. So at that point, if you had read that letter and you thought, okay, these people are totally delusional, I think it's time to sell. You would have gotten about $60 for your share. If you had held on to it and thought, well, maybe they'll turn this around, by the end of the year you got 60 cents for that same share. So it seems almost ludicrous. And I guess I'd love to share this with you, if I may, Manish. Why is it? Why is it that people discount and don't seem to want to recognize the truth of how powerful words are, both in creating the future and providing very, very accurate insight into the quality of people that we're dealing with. And it's a story that in 2009, during the, again, height of the economic collapse, my IP lawyer called me and asked if I had read Goldman Sachs' shareholder letter. And I hadn't. He said, well, could you just read that because, I can't understand it. I don't know what's wrong. I can't understand it. Could you read that? And so I did. And in doing so, I learned that they were writing about. The first part of the letter was very well written. It flowed. It was logical and it made a lot of sense. But suddenly it was like the bus ran off the road, and the next paragraph was totally disjointed. There were a lot of weasel words in it. It just didn't make sense. Well, what were they writing about? This was the section in the letter where they were trying to explain how the fact that Goldman Sachs was one of the top counterparties to AIG, and therefore when AIG got bailed out, it bailed out Goldman Sachs, and the fact that Paulson was involved, clearly they were not comfortable with reporting on that. I called my lawyer and I said, can you ask me what it was that you thought you didn't understand? He said, well, I just didn't understand it. I said, well, of course you couldn't understand it. It's absolutely convoluted, and and they're not being straightforward. How come you couldn't see that? And he said, I didn't think I was smart enough. And I think that's something that happens, again, as part of our human wiring, that for some reason we doubt ourselves. We doubt that people that we trust, that are leaders, that they could be duplicitous to us. So, and I think that's what happens.
We put too much faith in the authority and the leadership, and we just are sometimes gullible and believe it.
Well, we're gullible, and of course there's that famous folk tale by Hans Christian Andersen that is the Emperor's New Clothes, and of course everybody in the kingdom doesn't want to believe that the emperor is actually marching naked down the streets of the kingdom until a small boy says, he's not wearing any clothes, and then everybody suddenly they regain their sight. So there's that herd mentality, that kind of mindset that, well, if everybody else believes this, then I guess I'm wrong. I can't trust my own vision of this.
Very well said, and these are some non-verbal, non-quantitative signals that investors have to learn to decipher and integrate it with other things that they may have in coming to a composite picture of the situation of the company or the industry.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think not just for investors, but also for managements. In fact, I recently got a letter from the CEO of a company who read my book, and he was so excited. He wanted to send it to other directors of companies on which he sits on their boards. And he said, if I was still a CEO today, I'd be sending it to all of my managers. Because this is a tool for investors to be able to make, as you point out, more refined decisions, but it's also for managers to communicate more effectively with their people so that they can be more effective and the company can succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And getting back to your observation early on in our discussion when you were talking about the alignment of people and how the execution, when you have clarity, you get better execution.
Switching the topic here a little bit, explain to our audience what do you do now, and how did you get into writing?
Well, now I continue to do the research on Candor Analytics. So every year we evaluate 100 companies in our benchmark survey and rank order them high to low, and then we can create a portfolio of companies in which you can make a very sound investment. And I'm in discussions with people right now who want to launch this as a smart ETF in index exchange traded fund. So we're doing that, consulting with companies to support them in wanting to gain more clarity and alignment. And it's incredible how work like that actually leads to improved financial performance and valuation. And then thirdly, we've just developed a workshop that we are going to be rolling out at a number of companies called Candor Boot Camp. And it's a 3-part workshop based on working with companies to gain a sensitivity and awareness of the principles of candor so they can have a stronger sense of candor as individuals, and then also how to bring those principles in working with teams inside a company so you can have more candor in your teams. And then finally, looking at the enterprise and evaluating the degree to which the enterprise is designed to encourage and promote candor throughout the company. So we're very excited about this, and we've had some great conversations with companies. Did you ask how I got to this?
Yeah, how did you get into this, and what is your background so readers can understand a little bit more about you as well?
So I got I started this after leaving Wall Street. I was working on, I was an investment banker for a number of years at Lehman Brothers, actually. And I left, I wanted to try something. I wanted to start a business. So I left after in the late 90s, and I started this investor relations company. And that's when I began to study the impact of communications. And I think that comes from my background. I've got an MBA in finance, but also I've studied psychology and sociology and how organizations function. So it's a powerful combination to have the ability to raise money and then also look systemically at how people and their businesses and organizations work together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a big passion. In fact, I got to know Warren Buffett. I've written 3 books now with his support. The first one was written after 9/11 and the fall of Enron, and I wanted to write about trust because it was clear that there was a time when trust was looking as if it had been shattered. Trust in the security and safety of our society, trust in the financial system and in companies who had lied to their investors and so on. And after I finished writing Trust, I realized that if a company and if people aren't truly committed to candor, then it's going to be very hard to have and sustain trust. And that has led to the current work I'm doing. But I wrote to Warren in 1997 to tell him about the fact I was analyzing shareholder letters, and he wrote me back and said that you're doing the work of the angels. Not something I had expected, but then he invited me to his shareholder meeting that year, which I attended in Omaha, and I wanted to see if he was the same person in real life as he seemed to be in his writing. And of course, I went and saw that was the case, and I've been going to the meeting ever since, every year.
Oh, very nice. Thank you very much for your time and your comments, and I'm sure investors will benefit more from this if they can pay a little bit more attention and read between the lines with a little bit clarity.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing and bringing nonfiction books into the world.
Thank you.